Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to our 162nd Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. Before Pete takes over with his talk, I wanted to remind folk that after this week, we stop for a few weeks because we then meet in person at a few different events. There is going to be the Reading Football Economics Conference on May the 7th and 8th. So just less than 2 weeks away, and that will be here in Reading. It will also be joined with the Sports Economics Sports Management International Conference. And hopefully, if you are presenting, you know about that, and you've been hounded by another email from me today. If you're a presenter and you haven't registered yet, please do so. And if you want to attend, please do also register so that we know how many folk to expect and cater for. That will be brilliant. Then after that, we meet there's the 18th Gijón Sport Conference in Sports Economics, May the 10th and 11th. And then May the 13th and 14th, the 10th Football and Finance Conference at the University of Duisburg-Essen. And again, you can register. There's information that I'll post in the chat. If you're interested in attending that conference, there's a conference website, which I was going to share my screen and show the website. Instead, I'll put the link in because I don't want to disturb the delicate balance that we've got in terms of Pete sharing his slides. So without any further ado, Pete Groothuis is going to be presenting A Rising Tide Raises All Boats, the changing distribution of salaries in the NBA over time. All yours, Pete.
Thanks, James. Once again, I always enjoy coming to Rose's on a Friday. This particular project started about a year ago when me and TB sat down and said, let's do some work together on the NBA. TB is a management professor here at App State. And so we were looking for somewhere where economics and management crossed. And then later on, Mark, who is a time series economist, joined the project. And I thought at the time of my first publication, or my first thing I worked on in Journal of Sports Economics, which was 23 years ago. Rich Hill, who was my undergraduate professor at Central Michigan University, had called me up and said, hey, Pete, your dissertation was on unions. I think there's something going on in the collective bargaining agreement that might be worth looking at. And so I said, hey, TB, why don't I revisit this to see if my prediction with Rich was true and look at it with the changing distribution of income over time. And so this is how the project was born. And the basic abstract is using a 33-year panel of all players who earn above the rookie minimum scale, so all full-time workers, we explore the changing distribution of salaries over time. The first thing we really found was there was a really substantial increase of all salaries as revenues rise in the NBA. That's the term. Rising salary rises all boats. Mark, who's a time series economist, said, you know what, we could probably use this data and look at it with a structural break analysis to see if indeed something's going on. And what we found is there's really three eras that we want to address where there were structural breaks. So the first thing I want to look at is just the rising tide of salaries and income as without any sort of structural break. So if we look at revenues between the start of our data set, which was 1990-91, to the present last year, 2021, 2022, I guess 2 years ago, we found that salaries grew by 475%. They grew from about $2 billion a year to about $11.2 billion. And then if we just treat it as a rising tide and do a yearly trend analysis, we find that yearly the revenues are rising about $255 million a year. Uh, we all have kind of talked this in our sports econ classes and other where we've known that because the only TV or things that people tend to watch live anymore are sports, we know that there's been a lot of revenues generated in that manner. And this just points that out. Now, if we look at the rising tide of just kind of the distribution of income, we find that all boats rise, but not necessarily at the same rate between the beginning and the end of our time series. Kind of when I was looking at it, the median income at one point in 1990-91, half the players made about $1.5 million a year. That is now about the, let's see, that's between the 5th and the 10th percentile. So we find that, and if you look at the mean salary is, I'm sorry, the median salary is 4.69, and we find that that was above the 90th percentile in 1991. And if you really look at the top of the distribution, you see that's where the growth was the highest. Revenues in this time period grew by 475%. And then if you look at it, the people who probably didn't do the best were in the 25th percentile, and the people who did the best were in the top end of the distribution. Once again, this is strictly just the rising tide. And then if we once again use trend analysis, I thought that it was worthwhile to kind of just look to see what has happened over time to the mean, median, coefficient of variation. And what we're really trying to get at in this particular study is what's happened to the overall distribution of income, which is why the Gini coefficient is there. And what we find is the mean has risen quite substantially at about a $213,000 a year rate. The median about 87,987 a yearly rate, and even the Gini coefficient has risen from the beginning to the end, but it's relatively slow. And when it comes to skewness or kurtosis, nothing really happened. If we look at the percentiles or the deciles, we find that all of them also grew. For the 10th, 20th, and 30th percentile, they're growing about $42,000 a year. And the 90th percentile is growing by $630,000 a year. So it really looks like the top of the distribution is doing much better than the bottom of the distribution when you look at it as a whole from the beginning to the end. And if you look at the Lorenz curve between the beginning and the end, we see that's exactly the case. In 1990 and 1991, the income distribution was much tighter than it is today in 2021, 2022. So here's where Mark comes in. Mark was a time series economist. I brought him out of retirement, and I've worked with him in the past when there's a time series trend data to see if indeed there's some breaks in that trend that can then it's I guess you'd say theoretical. It just looks at the data and finds where there's breaks. And then what you do is look back at the history and see if somehow those breaks align with anything particular. So I said, I called up Mark and I said, is there a way that we can use this analysis in the MBA? And he said, yeah, sure, that will work. And so here are some examples of how Mark, and actually I have used this time series analysis. I'm not a time series economist, but it finds that particular technique is useful to find where there are changes. The first article that Mark did in sports was titled, "Was There a Structural Break in Barry Bonds' Bat?" He and with some of his colleagues. And what he did is in this Journal of Quantitative Analysis Sports, he took the career of Barry Bonds and looked at home runs, ERAs, and saw what happened over time. And not surprisingly, there was a structural break just about the time he started using steroids. And then the first time I worked with Mark was when we were doing a brown bag seminar here at App State, and he had mentioned to me that, hey, you got some interesting data on baseball over time. Let's see if there's a structural break in the average home runs over the years, earned run I'm sorry, runs batted in, all the different things, just but in terms of the aggregate. And so he ran the break analysis and he discovered there were two structural breaks. One at the time of Babe Ruth. So Babe Ruth not only was a big home run hitter, he also changed the game. Through his successive home runs, everybody started hitting home runs. And then the second break corresponded to the steroid level in sports. And so we made the case that there were two changes in the game. One corresponded with Babe Ruth and changing technology, and the other with the use of steroids. And then Craig Depkin, myself, and Mark uh, used hockey data to see what was going on with um, fighting and long-term penalties in the National Hockey League. And ultimately, what we found was there was a rise of the enforcer in the National League Hockey. And then about the time the Europeans started to join the league, that's when community deterrence through the enforcer started to fall, and we saw more reliance on the referees and the like. And so I said, Mark, can we do this with this particular analysis? And he said, maybe. Turns out our data set is probably a little shorter than what's ideal. When I talked to Mark, he said, don't be surprised if we don't find much because you've only have 33 years, which is not too short, but unlikely that we'll find breaks. So if we do find breaks, that probably means something significant happened. And so he did this analysis, and the K represents controlling for the number for serial correlation. And then he identifies breaks using his technique. And he found that revenues broke in 2014, and then they broke again in 2018 and 2019. And then the median salary broke. There was a structural break at 2005 and 2006. And then probably the most important one for this particular analysis that we're doing today, both the mean salary and the Gini coefficient broke at the 1997-98 season, and then broke again in the 2009 and 2010 season. And the Gini coefficient had the most significant break other than the revenues. The revenue break was also quite high at the 1% level. So let's look at revenues first. And between 1990 and 2014, it truly was just a rising tide. You'll notice that in 1998 and 2010, there was a dip in revenues. Actually, 2011, both of those were when the NBA experienced a lockout, when there was labor disputes. And so the revenues just kind of followed that trend over time. And then it jumped drastically in 2014, 2015, kind of watching the red line, and then it fell drastically and then jumped up again. So here's where you look at the historical data to see if something can be aligned with the structural break. And what we found, it didn't take much to find, in 2014 and 2015, this is when the league agreed upon a pair of nine-year deals for a combined $24 billion with the Walt Disney Company, which is home of ABC and ESPN, and what's now Warner Brothers Discovery Incorporated, which owner of the TNT. There was this contract for $2.7 billion per year, which was almost triple the annual value of the previous agreement. So in 2014 and 2015, there was a big jump in the revenue tide. And of course, the second break, if you go back up here, the second break occurred pretty much the time of COVID. So the first break, increases in revenue from the contract, and then the decrease because of COVID. And then we wanted to do is look at how does this go with salaries. And if we look at the median salary between 1990 and 2005, it climbed at a relatively high clip. And then it was a slight drop in 2005, and then it dropped, and it followed a less steep increase over time. And then if we look at mean salaries increased, and then they, in about 1998, 97, 98, they jumped up, but they increased at a slower rate. And then in 2010, they dropped quite a bit, and then they have been increasing since then at more of an increasing rate. And so what we decided to do, oh, I'm sorry, one more. This is probably the one that's most important to our analysis today. If we look at 1990 to 1997, 98, we see a big increase in the Gini coefficient, which is indicating a big increase in the income distribution. Big increase in inequality in the NBA. And then between 1997 and 2010, the Gini coefficient falls slightly. And if you recall, that 1997-98 was when that was really the time period we were looking at in my first paper. And so the prediction Rich and I talked about in the paper, that there was this Robin Hood rent redistribution between that we see that the superstars and the rookies, we see that the income distribution doesn't climb as quickly. And then in 2010, there's another structural break, and that structural break we've seen an increase in the Gini coefficient. So initially, the Gini coefficient was rising. As it became more and more unequal, then it fell slightly, and then it broke and it started to increase once again. And these are the three eras that we address. And then when we looked at historical data, what we found was almost all of the structural breaks could be online with changes in the collective bargaining agreement. The median salary broke in 2005 and 2006. And that was the time when there was a renegotiation of the collective bargaining agreement, but there was no lockout in that particular time period. When I look at the history, that was about the time period when the National Hockey League had, had lost their season. And so they said, we really want to make sure that we can agree. But we did see a break there. But in terms of the Gini coefficient in the mean breaks, which was in 97, 98, in 2009 and 2010, they were pretty close, corresponding to the lockouts. The first one, 1998, 99, is pretty close to the 6-month lockout. And then the 2011, 2012 lockout was a 5-month lockout. And so we've decided to define these as the eras. The first era is what happened between 1990 and 98. The second era is what happened between 98 and 2010. And then the third era from 2010 to 2023. And this is where we need to look at, what do unions do? Like you said, this is kind of coming full circle for me. My dissertation was on unions, and we looked at the idea of how there's appropriable rents and the power of the median voter. And back in 1980, the big thing people were looking at is there was really two faces of unions. Usually as economists, we think of unions as a monopoly seller of labor, that because they are bargaining for everybody, they can restrict the quantity of workers and raise the wage. That's the idea of a trade union. And even in a crafts union, the same thing. It turns out in sports, it's hard to talk about the monopoly face without talking about the fact that it's a bilateral monopoly. Prior to from the history of the past to the present, we realized that the reserve clause had provided monopoly power to owners, so they could always keep the wages low because you couldn't sell your services on a free market. And so we know that there was high exploitation early in pretty much all sports leagues in the United States. Um, and one of the first things that unions bargained for was free agency. They never looked at free agency for everybody, but the idea was we need to break this reserve clause. And if we can increase free agency and we start to see more market, the idea here is, well, productivity matters. And if we have free agency, we'll see an increase in the salary distribution. It'll become more unequal because of the productivity difference between players. And of course, the second phase of unionization, let's see if I can move this up. There we go. Unions in professional sports are also known as a collective voice. It's a political, there is really no entrepreneur owner of a union. We are all a collective of workers, and we agree upon through a union vote. And so from a political perspective, a median voter model is a better way to represent a union than just strictly being a monopoly. And in a median voter model, you start to say, well, who can we exploit? If the median voter is the middle of the distribution, well, one place we can exploit are people who aren't members of the union. One of the things we notice in the traditional union, sometimes there's a two-tiered wage scale. The new entrants don't get as much as the current entrants. And that's the case of the rookie scale. Rookies aren't part of the unions. So by voting for a collective bargaining agreement, you can take advantage of rookies who aren't part of the union. And then second, if the top of the distribution is gaining the most because of their free agency and their talents, then you can restrict maximum salaries and then move those salaries back to the median voter. And that was kind of the prediction Rich and I had made back in that 2001 paper. We also, according to the union voice model, unions tend to increase differences based more on seniority and other non-productivity characteristics. So seniority is more important than performance. And the thing of unions, when we talk about the collective voice median voter, is we tend to see a compression of salaries as opposed to an increase in salary. So in this case, we expect to see more of a equal distribution of salaries. Now, that brings us to NBA labor relations literature. And there has been some literature that has looked at this in the past. Like I said, the first one is Rich Hill and myself, and the Robin Hood rent redistribution. This is where we predicted this. Turner and Hakes, it was never published in a journal, but it's worth mentioning. They looked at quintile regressions and found that rookies that were the top, highest draft pick rookies were exploited. They were paid a lot less than their marginal revenue product. And then Hill and Taylor in 2008 did a general paper over the overall all unions, not just in the NBA, but all unions, and found that the traditional unionism does kind of explain seniority contracts, salary compensations. And so the collective voice does a good job of explaining, even though we generally think of sports unions as being monopolies, they're really also playing that median voter collective voice. And then Hill and Jolly did an article just before the collective bargaining agreement in 2011, And they found that superstar rookies were exploited the most, and they were exploited and then their rents could be distributed back to the other players who weren't quite as productive. And then Johnny Duck and myself and Rich Hill looked at the idea of a minimum pay scale. During this time period, the minimum wage scale increased with tenure. And there was fear that because I'm forcing teams to pay a high wage for a senior worker, they may fire them and then replace them with a cheaper player that had less tenure, less experience. And what we found was that was not the case. And when we dug into the collective bargaining agreement, we found that the reason it wasn't the case is there had been provisions to say that if you do have to pay these higher wages due to seniority, that it doesn't go into the salary cap. There's a kind of a mid-range um, exception, and so that didn't really affect. So we didn't see cheap, low tenure, low seniority workers replacing high paid, more tenure. I'm sorry, greater seniority workers. And then an article that just came out in Contemporary Economic Policy, Kaplan looked at both the maximum salaries and the minimum salaries and discovered that um, there's about a 2.8 to 56.9% subsidy from these players given back to the less talented players. So we see that almost all of this literature in this area was pointing to the fact that there's a Robin Hood rent redistribution, that there's the superstars are still somewhat exploited. And these two quotes came up that I thought were useful to kind of illustrate what was going on in these time periods. First of all, owners claim that they're losing money and want to cut back greatly on the proportion of basketball related incomes designated for player salaries. Just before the 2011 lockout, players were making about 57% of basketball related incomes. And this was about the time of the Great Recession in the United States. And basketball owners were saying they're losing money. And so what the owners wanted was an agreement so they could get a bigger cut. Union leaders, on the other hand, have a difficult path to negotiation. The league is marketed on the performance of superstars. We know that there was the Magic Jordan years. The superstars is what people come to see. And in the September of 1995, when there wasn't a lockout, the superstars were not happy. Michael Jordan and Patrick Ewing called for a union decertification election. They said, we don't want to be represented by the union. So we realized that the superstars are the ones that make the money for the league, but they're also the ones that unions can exploit because they aren't all that important in the median voter model. Matter of fact, the next quote really drives this home. This is from an agent talking. If they cut the highest 25 or 30 salaries by, say, 35%, we're not going to have to change that much for the owners to get what they want financially. What they wanted financially is a movement from 57% of the basketball related incomes to a 50-50 split. LeBron can scream and shout all he wants, but this is a one man, one vote union. Once guys figure out that 400 or so players can benefit by the top few taking a major cut, what do you think they're going to do? They didn't actually give me the name of the player agent, but that was a player agent. But it kind of gets the idea of this conflicting views of union voice and monopoly face of unions, in particularly free agency. So that's the background in terms of the story. Now let's look at the three eras. Let's take a tour. If we look at the first era, defined by the structural break, it runs from 1991 to 1997. And if you see the blue curve, that represents the Lorenz curve at the beginning of the era, and the 90, 97, 98, the end of the era. And notice in this particular era, all the difference between the red line, the blue line, and the red line shows that for all the 5th percentile all the way to the 95th percentile shows a more unequal wage distribution. This is where we see the biggest growth of the Gini coefficient. And if you look at it graphically, we see this is indeed what's going on here. Once again, I go back up here. There is no spot in the salary distribution that isn't becoming more unequal. So what was going in this time period to make it so unequal? Well, first of all, before I do that, sometimes it's worthwhile to look at the rising tide between the beginning and the end of the era. During this area between 1990 and 1990 and 97, revenues increased that's why it's in bold at the bottom, at 81.5%. It had gone from 2 billion to 3.5 billion during that time period. And if you look at wage growth, we saw that the wage growth was the highest for the superstars, the people at the top. The 99% had a 248% increase in income. Matter of fact, the median and the mean was growing quicker than the median. And the median is really kind of what's driving the median voter model. And so the median, the workhorses of the league were not receiving benefits during this time period. Matter of fact, if you're in the 10th percentile or the 25th percentile, you saw very little wage growth during this time period. So what were the provisions of the collective bargaining agreement that might have driven this change in the distribution? Well, during this time, they had a salary cap, but it became known as a soft salary cap. There were ways to get around that salary cap relatively easy. And in all sports, there tends to be an arms race for the obtainment of star talent. And probably the biggest provision in the contract that caused this soft salary cap was known as the Bird exception. The way the Bird exception was named after Larry Bird, who was a player of the Celtics. What the Celtics did is they had a salary cap, and they signed all these other players almost all the way up to the cap. And then because of an exception, you can pay your own player more over the cap. They then renegotiated Larry Bird's contract, but it didn't matter. Even though his salary put him over the cap, it didn't count towards the cap. That's why it was known as that's why it's known as a soft cap, because people could spend a lot more on players than what was capped at. And during this time period, the majority of teams all exceeded that cap that had been set. So it was not, that's why it was called the soft salary cap, because it really did not play. During this time period, one of the provisions of the collective bargaining agreement is if the basketball revenue split had to be, well, if it exceeded 51.8%, the owners could call for a renegotiation. So in other words, if they couldn't control their own arms race, they could call for a renegotiation of that particular thing. And in 1997 and 1998, that's the time, the benefits had risen to 57.2%. So basketball players were making about 57.2% of the basketball related incomes. So they called for a renegotiation, which led us to the second time period. This is the time right after, or actually a year before the lockout. And if you look at this second era between 1997 and 98 and 2009 and 2010, the era between the two lockouts, what you find is if you look at the red line, which is 2009, 2010, is slightly inside the blue line. So during this era, the income distribution is becoming more equal. But if you look at it by each percentile, we find that really, yeah, if you look at the bottom, at the 15th percentile, the 20th percentile, the 25th percentile, and the 30th percentile, I actually all the way up to the 40th percentile, all saw increases in or less inequality. And in this side of the distribution, that meant they were getting a bigger piece of the overall pie because they're less distributed. And then if you look at the very top, the 95th percentile, you see that they're also becoming less equal, which means the superstars are indeed making less. So if we look at that, we find that at the top and at the bottom, there were, although there were definitely the middle of the distribution between 35 and 80%, there was no real change between the two time periods. So there's a little bit of narrow or increase, a little bit less inequality at the bottom and a little bit less inequality at the top. And once again, if you're at the bottom, that means you're making more money. If you're at the top, you're making less money. If we look at the rising tide of revenues during that time period, revenues itself rose by 52% between the beginning of that time period and the end of the time period. And we see that the mean and median grew essentially at the exact same rate. The superstars gained the least. The first percentile actually didn't do all that well, but the reason they're not doing all that well at this point is they'd already introduced a scale for minimum salaries in the NBA before that. I meant to mention that earlier. So what you'll notice is the people who gained more were in the lower end of the distribution, and then somewhat in the higher. 67%, 90%, and even the 95th percentile gained in that time period. One thing you'll notice is the mean grew quicker than the overall revenues. So during this time period, even though the split had gone to about 57% of revenues going to players, basketball related income, basketball related revenues going to players, they continued. So during this time period, they were still getting about 57% of the revenues. So what were the provisions that caused this? Well, one thing they found was the rookie contract was increased from 4 years to 3 years. So if you're going to exploit the rookies, it gives you more time to do that. And maximum raises were set per year. And also there was a hard salary cap. I should really say less soft. There were still a lot of exceptions you could get around. And during this time period, they'd gone from a straight minimum salary to a minimum salary that rose with experience. And it was not counted against the cap. And the mid-range salary exception was also not counted against the cap. And this is when they also introduced a luxury tax that had to be paid every year. So if you exceeded the cap, you would have to pay a luxury cap. I think during that time period, it was for every dollar you spent above the cap, the tax was also $1. But nonetheless, during that time period, the basketball related revenue still was about 57% to the players. And that was when the second lockout occurred. And the second lockout occurred essentially in 2011. Prior to 2011 was, like I said, the Great Recession in the United States. And so all the owners were complaining that they weren't making money. So they locked out the players. And what we find is under the new collective bargaining agreement that came about in that 2011 agreement is an interesting one. We all of a sudden saw that there was an increase in the top end of the distribution. So it's less, it's less equal than before as we move into the top end of the distribution. If we look at it by percentiles, you'll see from the 5th percentile all the way up to about the 45th percentile, very little or no changes in the distribution. But then when you go to the top of the distribution, we started to see that it became more unequal. Once again, if you look at it here in terms of the Lorenz curve differences, you see that it falls right. That there's a big significant difference in terms of the confidence interval between the 40th and the 100th percentile. So if we look at the beginning of the era to the end of the era, one of the big things we saw is revenues. This is really where revenues took off. It went 108% increase in revenues during this time period. And what we notice is the median only grew by 10%, the mean grew by 40%, which is kind of pointing out the idea that the superstars are doing better. And we see that's indeed the case at the top. However, nobody's doing as well as the NBA itself. And probably the reason that comes about is because in the 2011 agreement, one of the big things they pushed for was no longer 57%, but a 50-50 split. So if we look at it in terms of the collective bargaining agreement, the luxury tax is higher. The luxury tax became higher and it had a progressive rate. So as you were over the luxury tax, you would have to pay more and more. They also limited and made shorter contracts. In the past, you could have a 5-year contract, then they made it a 4-year contracts. And during those 4-year contracts, they had smaller annual raises. They also limited the mid-range exception, and basketball income was only split 50-50. So those are the 3 eras. What did we learn in terms of this analysis? Structural breaks identified 3 eras in sports. The first era saw an increased salary inequality consistent with the push for free agency. We make the argument this is the era that really the monopoly face of union was there to counteract the monopsony power of the owners. The second era saw a slight decrease in salary inequality, which is more consistent with the collective voice median voter model of unions. This is really the era that Rich and I in our paper had kind of predicted. And so it's always nice to find that one of your predictions that you made in the paper tends to hold true. Now, the third era, which I need to think more about, it seems like it's more of a hybrid era. There's still the monopoly face that's going on because it does seem like the superstars matter. We know that they matter. And it seems like they've been able to, in the rising revenues, been able to get more and more for themselves and not exploited as much as during the middle era. And so we kind of make the case that this is a combination of both the monopoly face and the collective face in this last union. And let's see. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Pete. I am going to give you a Teams round of applause. That was a really very interesting talk. fascinating data set with lots of depth
I'll
on
see if I can-
salaries. And we've got time for questions. So we've got Steve first, then Kenneth.
I cannot see people.
I hope you can hear them. Steve, go ahead.
Hi, Steve Ross. I'm a lawyer, not an economist, from Penn State, but I really appreciated your analysis. A comment and then a question. Again, from a lawyer's perspective, and maybe this doesn't mean anything, doesn't have the phrase "superstars are exploited" does not have the same connotation to economists that it does to lawyers, which is a negative term. I think you are right post hoc, but one of the things I always learn from economists is you have to look at a deal ex ante and not post hoc. And the question is, how many superstars know they're going to be superstars when they first become members of the union? And so if you look at a collective bargaining agreement on an ex ante basis, it may well be that if you don't, and if you're like in the Rawls veil of ignorance and you don't know exactly where you're going to be, then you might agree to a scheme where you end up getting less than you would have been in some other scheme. But that's no different than if I offered to buy your house for you in 5 years, and then it turns out 5 years from now that your house has gone way up in value and I'm getting a great deal. Nobody would say you're being exploited by that deal. So that's just a comment on that sort of phrasing. My question is, as you may know, in 2014, when they had the huge increase in media deal and then the huge increase in the salary cap, the NBA went to the Players Association and they said, let's renegotiate the CBA and have a smoothing out period so that instead of this massive 1-year jump, we can take it in stride. And they had a number of arguments as to why that was sort of better for competition design. I think ultimately there was so much distrust that the players thought this was just trying to save the owners money and not give the players the full benefit. So they never reached an agreement on this. But I think if you can find journalistic reports of that break, I think it would be really valuable if you could estimate what the distribution among players in the would have been using your data had there been this smoothing instead, to see in hindsight, did the players actually make the right decision or the wrong decision, especially for the median voter. So I don't know if you have looked at that or if that's something you could do, but I think that would be really interesting because it also goes to just questions of union strategy and how they figure out things, and that would be a really useful contribution.
No, we hadn't looked at that yet because, to be honest, the market just within about a week ago had done the structural break we'd done salaries before, and I said it'd be worthwhile to do it for revenues as well, and man, there is a big jump, like you said, in that 2014. So I need to dig in to see what happened. Yeah. Between the union and the owners at that point. Thanks for the comment and the question.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Kenneth is next.
Yeah, Steve, I think once again, just like last week, we're kind of on the same page with the questions. I was going to ask the same about considering the large spike in the salary cap and the option of smoothing and not smoothing. And this analysis actually has been done. So the work is there for you, and you don't have to necessarily calculate it yourself. It can actually probably be pretty easy to find. If you're having trouble, I can find it. It's also, I believe, written in the CBA, not the counterfactual, but the actual smoothing. So that was going to be my question if you had looked at that, because I think that definitely rose the salaries of the medium to the kind of higher level players, but really hurt the lower level players.
Yeah, I just can say that it kind of really did raise my eyebrows when he had done that structural break analysis. I guess I hadn't been paying attention that there was such a jump at that time period. Yeah.
It's crazy, and still, at least in the basketball community, joked about quite a bit that players like Alan Crabb can essentially make more than a lifetime's worth of money and now be out of the league, or Chandler Parsons was certainly a benefit of this as well, among others. But my main question is if you've also looked at union leadership, both from like the representation perspective, like I believe Michelle Roberts was the head of the union. Was it Michelle Roberts during the decision not to smooth? And then also from the player perspective, because I think a large part of this salary renegotiation in favor of older players came actually recently while Chris Paul was the head of the players union, and notably he was about to enter into the age range in which it would have been favorable for the salary to increase after you've hit the years of experience.
Yeah, one thing we have not done is really any digging into who are the leaders and the like. Yes, we realize that that's what we have to do next, is to really kind of dig into what was going on. I kind of know what was going on in the 1998 salary negotiations, but not so much in the others. But yeah, I think that's something we definitely have to do, is find out who is doing the negotiations.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty, I don't know that there's any formal like reporting or admitting this, but I think Chris Paul is kind of known to be a savant of the salary cap himself, and has also, I don't think, ever given up his bird rights, despite being on multiple different teams, therefore being, as you described, being able to earn a higher salary that doesn't count against the initial cap, at least. So he's one to definitely look at that might be an anomaly and could even throw off your data a bit.
Great, thanks, Kenneth. Any more questions and comments?
Can I just jump
Go on, Steve? Yeah.
Back in again while we're waiting? The median voter model is a really useful tool that you introduce. And I wonder if it has been empiric. I mean, I wonder if you've done any work or can think. I can't do it because I'm not a social scientist, but I'm very generous with you all's time. And whether this can be empirically demonstrated that unions actually behave according to the median voter model as opposed to other models. And then the other thing in this general area, if you are looking at it, that non-economists would greatly benefit from, and for reasons I do not understand, the unions don't do it themselves, but they have the data and they should be willing to cooperate, is what is the economic effect on the minimum salary? It's my contention that in National Football League, and I'm not exactly sure how it works in basketball, but in the National Football League, it's absolutely clear that the biggest benefit of the union is the minimum salary. And this is based, as lawyers often do, on an anecdote, which is the minimum guaranteed salary nowadays is something like about $675,000. And if you go back to the days when they had a free market in the practice squads, which the NFL got rid of, but at one point there was a free market in practice squads, and there were about 15 or 20 players that earned a decent living in a free market. And the vast majority of players on the practice squads in a free market were getting $1,000 a week. And if you think about the difference, what is the reservation price for a player who would be the 53rd player to make the final player on the roster if there were no union? It's not remotely close to $675,000 for the chance to be on the roster and get money. So if there's any way you could use economic tools to estimate what the free market for the last two players on the roster would be, and then compare it to the CBA minimum, you get some idea of the huge benefit that the CBA confers on those players.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember years ago when we were first started this union analysis, it said that not only the median voter benefits, but because it's a more of a collective voice for everybody, they tend to be in favor of helping the lower end of the distribution more than the upper end. And that's exactly what you're saying.
So
the minimum salaries.
Another reason I think this is relevant, again, for a policy observer of like your paper that you presented today, is when you say, well, gee, the 25th percentile increased 147%, but the 99th percentile increased 584%. That looks unequal. But to me, one of the things I'm going to think about is, well, what would the free market salary of the 99th percentile be? And what would the free market salary be of the 25th percentile? And there's a good argument that it's a much greater inequality. And so the union effect actually has effect of reducing inequality.
Yeah, I will agree with you. Unions have really been there to reduce inequality.
Thanks, Steve. On a more technical note, Pete, as a former time series econometrician myself, what was the method of structural break detection that you used?
Actually, it's one by CLXII and Lee. That's why I can send you the actual paper. I'm not a time series economist, but Mark CLXII and Jun-Sung Lee, it's their particular technique that it's actually been used quite extensively.
Yeah.
Definitely not so much in sports, but but in other areas.
Yeah, no, if you send that, that'd be really interesting.
Sure, I'll send it to you.
Any more questions and comments? Well, I'll comment quickly, I guess more definitely as a comment than a question, is I was kind of struck by your three different eras because in some respects, I don't believe that the same data on individual salaries exists for football as it does for US sports, but at a more aggregate level, you can look at wage bills, and you can look at the the amount of revenues that clubs in the Premier League in England are earning, and there's certainly the pattern there was that you had a very sharp increase in the inequality and outcomes in the Premier League in the 1990s, kind of through to about the mid 2000s, and then you had dropping off, and you had a whole bunch of different teams winning the competition, culminating in Leicester City winning it, and then in the recent years, it's kind of taken back off again. One of the explanations I think for that actually is very different from obviously what you're looking at, but it was the distribution of television revenues changed, and so when the Premier League was set up, international television revenues were pittance, and so they didn't care about them, so they said, oh, we'll just split them evenly across all 20 teams, whereas the domestic revenues will make sure that the best teams get more of them. By by 2010, 11, 12, 13, the international television revenues were the biggest part. So it meant that overall the distribution of revenues was more equal than it had been in the early days of the Premier League, and as a result, the outcomes were arguably more equal. But then since then, we've gone back because the big clubs decided that this wasn't quite right, and so they engineered a vote, and now the international revenues go more to the big clubs as well. And as a result, now we have the same team winning the Premier League every season. So that kind of pattern of increasing inequality, some kind of stabilization, and then things taking off again. It's possibly, I don't know, maybe it's common across lots of different sports and different contexts.
Yeah, I think in most of the American leagues, it's pretty much an equal split between teams.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, that's an interesting comment. So yeah, yeah. So in it European leagues are always much different. Do they
Yeah.
have collective bargaining agreements in soccer, football?
No, not that I'm aware of. No, it's all very individualized.
Yeah.
The only real limits are on when players can be traded. So they'll be limited to a window in the summer and a window in the middle of the winter.
And I do know there's transfer fees, which is
Yeah,
different.
exactly. So you can essentially buy out a player out of their contract. You compensate the team that's got the player's got a contract with. But obviously, if the player's out of contract, they can go wherever they like.
Okay.
So I guess free agency is the kind of the term that's
Yeah. Yeah, that's
in
what we
North
use.
American sports. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Any more questions and comments? In which case we will wrap up. Thank you very much, Pete. Thanks everyone for questions and comments. As mentioned at the start, we now take a break for a few number of conferences. The next scheduled talk is on the 31st of May, so just over a month from now. Joel Carriel presenting the Sterling Effect, investigating racial discrimination in the English football labour market. There is a slot on May the 24th that's not yet filled, I've just noticed. So if someone does want to present on May the 24th, that slot is open. Do get in touch if you want, or someone who might be interested. But otherwise, I hope to see a number of you in the next few weeks at the conferences that are taking place. And if not, I look forward to seeing you all again in this context in a few weeks' time. So thanks very much, everyone. Have a great weekend. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.